Okay, Cassandra, can I start? Is that all right? Okay. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you the day after Lughnasadh. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure. Harvest Festival. So today we're going to be rerooting Jesus, or Yeshua, as he would have been called in his Aramaic context, in Galilee, in Second Temple period Palestine, which is a moment when the Jewish people are oppressed by the Roman Empire after a series of imperial oppressions and dislocations and exiles. And I wanted, there's a lot of history we can get through, and there's a lot of context, but I kind of, just before I sat down, decided to start at the end of this class and then circle back, because last time we were talking about how in oral culture, you're constantly circling back and going in these cycles rather than trying to drive through the narrative. So I decided to try and actually practice that. So we're going to start at the end of what I had created for this class, which is we're actually going to start inside of some of the teachings of Jesus by rerooting them in his Judaism and the Aramaic and Hebrew he would have actually spoken and been raised inside, and see how that begins to massage and shift what we think he was meaning. So I think I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can do this. Meeting, start share, PowerPoint. Can you see that, Cassandra? Is that good?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, so we're going to start here, which is we're going to look at some of his the sayings that are most attributed to him that we think we understand by rerooting them a little bit. And then we'll go back and actually work through the history. And so the way I'm going to structure the class today is lecturing, going through some of this information. And then in the last hour, we have so much stuff that people are collecting, so many practices, so many observations and questions, that I really want to have the second half of the class be about that mutual inquiry. So that's where we will flow into for the second half of this session. Okay, so let's locate Yeshua, Jesus, in Galilee. And we think of him as referencing the Father, and that's how it's translated in Greek, and it's how it's translated into English, and how a lot of us have encountered it. And of course, it's very easy to say, yeah, that's this patriarchal father figure. It's hierarchy, it's the king, it's the sovereign. But Jesus did not actually call God Father. He was doing something that was very atypical for the time period. So he lived in Galilee and he taught in Galilee. And Galilee was really rural. It was the peasant part. There's northern Palestine and southern Palestine, Judea and Galilee. And most of the literacy and most of what we think of as book learning Judaism was associated with the southern part of Palestine. But he comes from the rural social banditry, Elijah, magical storyteller tradition of the North. And he also comes from people who are they've known so much violence and so much intensity that it's really hard to get their attention. That, you couldn't arrive and be some little, docile person telling these cute little stories and have these hardcore peasants who've seen their relatives be killed, who've seen their religion be oppressed, who've had their land taken from them. Someone needs to mute themselves, I think. Everyone could just check and see. See someone's making some noise, okay. That you have to be kind of surprising and defamiliarize classical ideas to get these people's attention. Otherwise, they're not going to think you're really up to it. So when Jesus said Father, what he was really saying was Abba, which means Papa. So it's a kind of intimate, funny way of summoning God. It's a very intimate way of summoning God, actually. And a lot of the imagery that Jesus would use to summon God was actually what would have been considered at the time period feminine, which was another way of category violations that would catch people's attention, get people excited and probably frustrated and angry. But it was his way of probably engaging the populace. It would have been shocking that Jesus not refer to God in a more traditional way. When he said, when he referred to our Father who art in heaven, it would be more like Papa who dwells in the divine realm amongst us. And it is important to remember that rhetorical skill paired with embodied presence was probably something Jesus had learned from other storytellers in the area. It was a kind of, we talked last time about how Jesus was probably like a performer. He had to learn how to surprise people. It was your entire organism performing and channeling the charisma of the earth itself. Many people said of Jesus that he spoke with authority, which was a way of saying that the land chose him as an authority, just as it had chosen Ezekiel, Elijah, and Moses, and other prophets that came before him. Also, Jesus repeatedly articulated this intimate relationship with Papa as knowing. He used the word know. He knew God was upon him, just as Hanina ben Doza, who was another healer at that time period, knew that God was upon him when the fluency of prayer came through him. So this was something that was rhizomatic in Galilee. There were a lot of other healers who used this term to know, but it did not mean what we classically think of as to know. You know, when Jesus said the Spirit of God was upon him, we have lost the erotic and embodied meaning of such an assertion. For Jesus, when he explains that God is, when he says he knows God, he's explaining that this isn't an article of belief, it's an experiential reality, because the idea of knowing in ancient Hebrew actually was used to denote intimate sexual relationships between people. When you knew someone, it's because you had an actual embodied relationship with them. The word is actually yad in Hebrew. And it occurs repeatedly in Genesis. When you say, I know someone, it's because you have an intimate relationship. And then going from this kind of embodied erotic knowing that would have actually existed in the Aramaic before it was translated into Greek, I want to go into my favorite word that's been mistranslated, which is compassion and mercy. So those are two words that are very often associated with Jesus and his teachings that he brings up again and again and again. And they can feel kind of smug and distant. Practice compassion. But why did these words dominate his teachings if they're so smug and probably wouldn't have actually affected a rugged, hardcore, traumatized peasantry? The word compassion actually has a very rich semantic inheritance in the Hebrew Bible, with which Jesus was probably very orally familiar with. In both Hebrew and Aramaic, the word usually translated as compassion is the plural of a noun that in its singular means womb, rahim. Rachamin, the word used, came from the singular rachem in Hebrew for womb, and it was understood as the boundless and embodied love of a mother for their child. When it is translated into Greek and then Latin, it becomes an entirely different word composed of com and pati, which means to be with suffering. It was to be with love and embodied presence in Aramaic. It was to feel yourself being gestated and dreamed by the divine. Compati is not at all the original meaning of the word used by Yeshua. He was invoking his ancestors' polygendered, expansive bodily communion with a God that was less a man or a woman and more a generative space, a body to be inhabited that would create your very body. The only with suffering about the word he would have used, rachamin, was that if a mother suffers, the child in her womb would naturally suffer too. It invokes codependence. Both bodies are entangled and co-creative. Hebrew compassion is also translated into English mercy, which further neuters it, creating a power dynamic that does not exist in the original word, but does exist in the Romans' hierarchical oppression of the Jews. So when the Romans translate these things into their language, they articulate their power dynamics and put it onto a much more ecologically interdependent teaching. So that's one of those mistranslations that's really important to start looking at. Compassion and mercy are quite different indeed. Mercy implies someone in power grants mercy to someone below them and rearticulates Roman dominion over the Jews. You have a super and a subordinate summoned rather than a mother or like a parent, a gestating body and a child. This mistranslation co-opts the relationality and embodied love of the original word and turns it into a tool of domination. Mercy also implies wrongdoing and that someone must be pardoned for having sinned. Compassion, though, does no such thing. So when you read in English Bibles, God is good and merciful, you are getting a very deracinated, corrupted version of the original. God is wombful. God is loving physically and spiritually. God is giving you a home in their body. In the Hebrew Bible, this word is used as a visceral feeling and as a way of being that emerges from the feeling. It is at its root related to mother and child, but it's not associated with gender. Like, let's get rid of gender essentialism. Like, men in the Bible are described as having their wombs move. In Genesis, we see Joseph have his womb move. It's a kind of generative energy located in the root of you that anyone of any gender expression can experience. And it's how God gestates his people and takes care of them. It's very much, if we think of like how certain landscapes hold us and nurture us, it's very much a landscape holding all of the beings that constitute it. It's a very ecosystem-like term. You know, it was also used for people that have shared a womb, that grew up with each other in a womb. So brothers often talk of each other as sharing a womb. And men were said to be able to feel their wombs. And then we can see all of these examples in, you know, the standard accepted gospels translated to Roman of these words for compassion. And we can begin to compost it and think about it as womb. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved in his womb for them. It's a very interesting, you know, idea to imagine Jesus with a womb and then summoning a papa with a womb as well. So Jesus' statement, be compassionate as God is compassionate, is deeply rooted in an inherent relational divine experience beyond gender and beyond hierarchy, inherent to the Judaism he was raised with. To say God is compassionate is to say God is like a womb beyond gender, rooted in the fertility of the very land. And to say be like a compassionate God is to say to be like a womb, be wombish, be like a womb in the way that God is like a womb. So I kind of wanted to start there by showing how wild what he was actually doing was. He's coming in, he's saying, Papa. He's saying, like, this is my friend, Papa. He's my dad. He's fun. He's intimate. I know him in this very bodily way. And he's like a womb. So that's pretty radical. Okay, so we're starting there. And now I'm going to go back to the beginning. Here we are. Let me see if I can. Can I escape this or do I have to go back like this? Yeah, I just go back. Okay. Okay. So I've given you guys a timeline of the birth of Judaism and how it arrives in the Mediterranean basin. It fruits up from the same land where we see those Natufians that I've talked about in the first session. You know, the birth of agriculture, the birth of alphabetic literacy, the birth of viticulture and specific, like, which is the making of wine and beer and bread. We see fermentation fruit up there. And it's right there in the Fertile Crescent in the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, lying between the Nile River and Mesopotamia, and surrounded by all of the big Mediterranean ancient civilizations. Egypt, Babylon, you have the Arabian Desert and the highlands of Asia Minor. It's a place of overlap where there's always trade and there's always an influx of different intellectual cultures, different spiritualities. It's a meeting place, an intersection, a crossroads. So Jesus arrives at a crossroads culturally, spiritually, and physically. And Palestine is also a very interesting thing in that it has, you know, pretty much has jungle around the Jordan River. And then Galilee at the time of Jesus probably was closest to the ecology of Provence today. There's a scholar, Michael Haig, who's gone really deep into showing that we have this kind of backformed idea of Palestine as looking like it did today, but it's been subject to crusades and ecocide, and it's been changed. It was, you know, a very lush, interesting place. The Bible is full of, you know, jungle cats and lions and wild beings because they were around. They weren't made up. They were part of your actual lived existence. So I've given you this timeline that if you want to spend more time with, we could spend the whole session going through it. So I feel like we probably shouldn't do that. But what it shows is you have the birth of Judaism on top of Canaanite religions and being syncretically involved with them. And there's this idea that Judaism is monotheism, that only believes in one God. And it's a real misconception. Judaism is much closer to something called monolatry, which is it believes in its God. It says our God is associated with a specific place and it is the right God to worship. But other gods do exist. And in fact, they're sometimes dangerous. Like you have to be careful. You have to worship this God. And it's a big difference between monolatry and monotheism. Monotheism says there are no other gods. Monolatry says I am in an ecosystem of gods, and this is the one I've chosen to have a relationship with because it travels with me, it helps me out, it seems to be effective, and it's planted me in this really fertile, beautiful place that feeds me and takes care of my family. So monolatry really roots you into landscape. It says gods exist in certain places, and when you're in that place, you really need to have a relationship with that God. So this is just kind of walking through the initial history. Okay, yeah. And then, of course, the really important thing is there's a golden age of Judaism. We have judges, and then we have the kings and the monarchy. You have King David. King David, who's actually a very animist, kind of wild person, playing the lyre, writing poetry where he compares himself to animals. It's said that he reads the messages from gods and the going in the leaves, that he watches leaf patterns, and that's how he receives his messages from God. So we have this rich inheritance of these, and Joseph of Egypt, who dreams with wheat and receives prophecy in the figure of wheat in his dreams. They're almost like these vegetalistas of Galilee and Judea, these magical prophets and kings who receive their information from their God through the natural elements. And so that's the inheritance that's informing Jesus. But then, of course, and this is the most important part coming into his time period, you have radical violence, genocide, and dislocation. You first have the Assyrians coming in and destroying the 10 tribes of Israel at the top in northern Palestine. And basically, it's a complete genocide. We don't even really know what happens. I mean, some of these people may have gone to Egypt, but they're considered lost, gone. And then you have the Babylonian Empire coming in and destroying the temple and causing the exile. And then after the Babylonian Empire, you have the Persian Empire. And then you have Alexander the Great. So you have a series of these incredible imperial conquests of the Jewish people, and them trying to figure out what does it mean when we believe in a just God and we're experiencing injustice? What is this dissonance telling us? How do we begin to work with this narratively, culturally, and in our cultural body? Like we're experiencing massive trauma. How is that registering in our cultural body? And Tada, who's with us today, has come up with this idea of cultural somatics and really worked with that. And I would invite them in the question and answer part to really expand on that, which is, just like bodies register trauma in interesting ways, so do cultures register trauma over time in compelling ways and in certain types of illnesses and certain types of behavior. Okay. So we have the Torah. And so part of the Israelites' shared story was the revelation of a sacred text known as the Torah, which means the instruction. And it was traditionally, it represented the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, written by Moses. And it was a relational context adaptive oral practice, probably for most of its existence up until the time of Jesus. It was only very recently with the Babylonian exile that it was committed to writing. And so it was with this moment of being dislocated from your land and feeling like your people and your practices were perishable, that these things were finally put to writing. So then you have the actual written Hebrew Bible. And it's now agreed that it's like a symbiotic merger of 4 different authors or collective authorships, all with different political biases and probably from different places in Palestine. And they're all combined finally into one written text. So theologians as early as the 16th century noticed that many episodes in the Bible repeated, and these repetitions coincided with the use of different styles and names for God. So as we covered in the last session, the Torah is the final destination of a long oral tradition, an ecosystem of land-based beliefs and figures and episodes. finally set to text, probably by an elite male class, because writing is always in this time period practiced by people who have the leisure and the luxury and the social position to be able to do that. So what we're seeing is kind of a crystallization of an elite perspective, and 4 different elite perspectives that have been combined together. So the working theory is that you have J. I think I'm not going to go through this in detail right now, but it's really, really interesting. And there's an incredible book that I'm going to include in the resources called Who Wrote the Bible, that basically goes through all of these different threads. And it's interesting to see them braid together and to see that there are episodes and there are different versions of episodes. So you can kind of refract through them. It's like when you're, trying to research a crime and you get all these different perspectives, and then you can kind of get closer to what might have actually happened. And I'm not problematizing this symbiotic authorship. I actually think it's a way of creating something more resilient, interestingly enough, is when you have multiple perspectives, you suddenly more things come into view. You're not just isolated in one perspective. Okay. The most important thing for me is that the Hebrew Bible is not a series of rules, it is a series of stories. And as we talked about in the last lesson, stories are resilient and durable. They last. Lists of rules have a really hard time lasting, but if they're encoded in compelling narratives, they have a much better chance of surviving Exodus and exile and imperial rule. So modern theology ignores that the Bible is composed of stories whose messages disintegrate under heavy analysis. The story as story in most cases the teaching. So story theology emphasizes the centrality of the story over analytical meaning, and it interrupts the extractive nature of traditional theology, attempting to break down to parts the kernel of something so that it can be used and co-opted by empire. So Jesus came out of a world of holistic understanding, left brain somatically embodied, ecologically rooted stories. So what are the macro stories of scripture that would have informed him at that time period? So he was probably illiterate, living in Galilee as the child of peasants, of a tecton. We'll get to that in a little bit. And so his experience was the general weather system of the stories that dominated holidays and festivals and spoken Torah. And so one of the big dominant ones in the northern tradition was the story of Moses, which is the Exodus story. So after enslavement in Egypt, Moses leads his people through the wilderness to the land of milk and honey. And what seems very interesting about this is that you have to have 40 years in the wilderness between being in a dominator society and starting a new society. And that feels like something that's really relevant right now, which is as you're exiting a hierarchical system of extractive capitalism, you need to deprogram and decolonize yourself. And you probably can do that best in the wilderness, in the space between stories. And so there's this moment between stories where you learn how to ask the land for advice again before you arrive in the place where you will begin to make your home. So before you step from one civilization into a next, you need that interim period. And this was really integrated into the actual yearly celebratory cycles of Judaism, which is with the Feast of Tabernacles, you would actually put your tent outside and sleep outside and remember that you get to be inside and enjoy agriculture and the nourishment of the land and these cycles because of these moments when you're back in the animal world and you're back knowing that it's God that plants you in a place and brings you back into relationship with these cycles so that you can feed yourself and your family. So then we have a very historical story of exile and return, which is the Babylonian exile, which we talked about before. And it's interesting to think that the Torah is written during this time and it highlights the story of Moses, which is also in Exodus. So I think the important thing to remember is these are not stories that are static with clear moral values. They are interrogative stories, questioning your God, questioning yourself, saying, why did this happen? How does our God travel with us? Can our God travel with us? What's going to happen next? What are the new rules we need if we set up a civilization again so that we can avoid what happened in Egypt? a religious sensibility fermented in these narratives would not articulate spirituality as a static and certain cycle of sin, guilt, and forgiveness, but as a journey of liberation, hardship, and homecoming, and most of all, of movement. So now that we've got this kind of story ecology around us that would have been the weather systems that the people of Galilee were moving through, let's root into this time period. So let me see. Okay, yeah. So Jesus is born pretty much right after, there've been a series of puppet kings, and then Pompey comes and takes Jerusalem, and the Romans completely take over Palestine. But the Romans are a different imperial mechanism than all the other empires that have come before. And my question is, what sets the Jewish people on a collision course with 3 major revolts in 200 years of Roman imperial rule? Because before that, their revolts aren't as consistent, and in a lot of the other Roman colonized satellites, they don't have coherent revolutions. What is it specifically about this time period and this place in Second Temple period Palestine and Galilee that creates the pressure cooker for a figure like Jesus and for 3 major violent revolts? And I would say it's the movement from an agrarian state to a commercialized agricultural state, where the political and religious autonomy of the Jewish people are being eroded, while their spiritual understanding of what land is for is being constantly violated. So in the book of Leviticus, we hear, so this is one of the central tenets of Judaism at this time period, is that the land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. Throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. So land is not another commodity. Land is life itself, God itself. The land cannot be bought or sold. This is really perfectly crystallized in an episode in Kings, where King Ahab wants to buy a vineyard from a man called Naboth. And Naboth refuses, because it is against the law to steal ancestral inheritance. This prohibition against selling land to the highest bidder acts as a way of keeping land equally distributed among the population, regardless of economic status. Equal distribution of land is profoundly integrated into Jewish scripture and law. The land is sacred, it cannot belong to only a few, and you only get to farm it as a tenant. God owns the land. You are a tenant on that land, farming and caring for it as a way of showing your devotion to your God. So land is holy, to be used for holy purposes. And then the Romans come in and say land is to be used to maximize profits and to create empire. So we have land is sacred and then land is profit. There's a huge dissonance. So what do we see in an agrarian economy? We see that there's an 80 to 90% peasantry, and that this is the dominant division and social structure in the Mediterranean at this time period. So in a basic agrarian state, food production rises and so do populations. The peasantry do all the farming, they create a food surplus, and then this food is expropriated from them to increase the wealth of that small sliver of an upper class. But the really interesting thing is when you're just taking taxation as food from a peasantry, you don't actually see a high incidence of revolt. You see a lot of disgruntledness, you see people being angry, but you don't have systematic revolt in anthropological studies. It's the movement from an agrarian state to a commercialized agrarian state where you suddenly start to see a lot of revolt. So so when you have an agrarian state, farmers are still landed. They still have the land, and then they have to pay the taxes from what they produce on the land. But in a commercializing agrarian state, which is what the Roman Empire is, the emphasis moves from extorting taxes and surplus goods to extorting the land itself. So what the Romans do is they'll move into a place and they'll set up urban centers. They'll create like a new city. There was a city that was built and rebuilt, and it was, I think, 10 miles from where Jesus lived, called Sepphoris at that time period. So they'll set up these urban centers, and then they will collude with people who are willing to make money, and they'll start giving bad loans to farmers. And when the farmers default on the loans, they'll seize the land. So all of a sudden you see these cities all across Galilee that are slowly grabbing all the land. They're no longer just taking the food, they're taking the land itself, and they're consolidating land into like pretty much like giant farms or vineyards. And in fact, one of the big things that was happening at that time period is that grain fields were being converted into vineyards, because vineyards were more profitable, but they weren't actually feeding people. So whenever you would summon a vineyard owner in a story, which Jesus does, it would be an incredibly contentious thing to do. So that's another thing we've lost, is if you're preaching to a group of peasants and you're bringing up a vineyard owner, all of a sudden people are like, yeah, really? It's like summoning a Trump supporter in a story you're building. You would like, that's the same resonance it would have. Yeah, so in Galilee, food crops are converted into the more costly vineyards. And slowly more and more people are losing their land. And this isn't just about losing their property. It's a complete undermining of their belief system. The land that's supposed to be used to honor God and where God is actually situated is being taken from you and then used to make profits that is then taken out of your country. So this is creating a massive amount of frustration and anger. The key to remember is that Romanization was urbanization, and urbanization was always the entry point to commercialization. So it's through these cities that the Romans are able to dilate and expand their control in these centers. Slowly, the city would become the nucleus of nearby land, giving bad loans, and then becoming the location of all trade and seizing all profitable land. What happens when you have these two different opposing views, and then you have this incredibly violent overculture that is repeatedly executing people, coming into town and raping the women? I mean, I think the thing that's missing from a lot of depictions of the time period of Jesus is the constant, like, white noise of violence every single day. That every single day you were seeing people killed, you were seeing people thrown off their land, that it was constant. This was not a fun time. This was a time when your nervous system and your body were constantly contracting against the threat of being extinguished. So let's reroute Jesus a little bit in his specific place. So we don't have any reliable information about him before age 30. The nativity stories don't exist in the earliest stratum of texts. So the texts that are closest, probably that were written closest to him actually living, none of them include stories of his birth. So that's Paul's letter, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Thomas. In the next session, we'll go through all of those different texts and what was inside of them, and which ones are most reliable and which ones are probably not. He was probably born sometime right before 4 BCE, and at the end of the reign of Herod the Great, who he probably had brothers and sisters, they're mentioned, and he grew up in Nazareth, which was 100 miles north of Jerusalem. So in a different ecosystem than Jerusalem. So when he goes into Jerusalem, it's always important to remember that Jesus is headed into a culture where he doesn't understand the language. Like, I oftentimes think that Jesus is of the countryside, and when he goes into the city, the way he teaches doesn't necessarily work the same. And that we can oftentimes see him as his execution as being this kind of way that his inappropriate insertion into the city when he probably should have stayed in the countryside manifests. I oftentimes think, we were talking in the first session about Osiris and his box. I sometimes think that the city is Jesus's box, that the second he steps into Jerusalem, there's no way he's not going to be killed, because he's this loud, crazy Galilean peasant who likes to create conflict. But when he's in Galilee, it's very easy to keep moving through different little towns and stay outside of the Roman control. But when you're in the city, you're confined, and it's much easier to pin you down. And he grew up next to Sepphoris, where there was a Greek theater, where there would have been Greek drama, and where there would have been traders from all over the Mediterranean basin coming in. So we would have, sophists, we would have philosophers, we would perhaps have people all the way from India. So he probably would have been exposed to a lot of different belief systems and stories and culture. In fact, we can even imagine him going to this Greek theater in Sepphoris and watching the Bacchae, watching a production of the Bacchae about Dionysus. That Jesus probably, although he practiced Judaism, was exposed to a lot of different types of belief systems. According to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus was raised by a tekton. But the really interesting thing about tekton is it's been sterilized to mean carpenter. And it's kind of this fetishized idea of this, this nice little woodworker. But tekton has a very different meaning when we plant it back into context. It actually meant someone who had to travel for work and would repair small things that were broken in other people's homes, like a pasture wall. They would rebuild the stones, or they would fix someone's roof. And what it implies is that you had to do this because your farm had been seized. The land that you used to farm on had been taken because you've been given a bad loan and you had to give up your land. So Jesus was raised by someone who had lost their land because of debt. So when Jesus brings up debt, it's something he probably understood from the feet up. He lived in a society choked by debt. And we can use an anthropological and historical lens to analyze the fact that most of these crafts people who were doing the traveling work had been displaced from the land. They'd been displaced from their holy connection to the places where they probably buried their ancestors and composted them into the land and then eaten that food. It's a violent uprooting. So if we're talking about rerooting, Jesus's family has been uprooted. He would have learned hymns, stories, and prayers by ear, by breath. He would have celebrated many folk holidays, but in particular, he would have celebrated the traditional holidays of Passover, in the spring, recalling the Exodus from Egypt. He would have celebrated the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost. He would have celebrated Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, where you went outside and you had your harvest festival outside. And it was expected that most people would have gone for some of these festivals, men in particular, to Jerusalem to make sacrifice. But the problem is in Jesus's time period is because a lot of people are constricted by extreme poverty and illness and by work, they can't actually travel to Jerusalem to get clean and to restore their ritual purity. So this is going to become something that he's very interested in, is what does it mean if I can't go to Jerusalem for these festivals and make a sacrifice? How can I make my life clean? How can I make my life sacred if I can't do the things I'm supposed to do? We know that he was probably a religious seeker, but we should problematize that he had to go to India or Ireland to gain his spiritual wisdom. It was all there, nested within the biodiversity of Jewish teachers and schools of thought and the cosmopolitan city centers around Galilee. There were a lot of wild storytellers and prophets that were around at the same time period. Do I have? Yeah, so contemporary healers included Honi the circle drawer and Hanina ben Doza. Hanina lived just 10 miles from Nazareth, pretty much contemporary with Jesus in the town of Arab. And he was so famous that once a leader of the Pharisees in Jerusalem named Gamliel sent 2 of his students all the way up to Galilee to request prayers for his son who is ill. On arrival, Hanina said the fever had already departed. He told the envoy, "I am no prophet nor a prophet's son. This is how I know I am favored. If my prayer is fluent in my mouth, I know I am favored. If it is not, I know the illness is fatal." So these healers often talked about the experience of channeling, that they would do a kind of meditative practice where they experienced a stillness of the heart and a fluency of prayer. So that's that knowing that I talked about at first, that there's this intimate somatic experience with the divinity that lets you heal people. And And they also did a lot of the same things as Jesus, which is, sometimes we think of him as being an extraordinary person or a black swan event. But the truth is he was surrounded by a lot of people doing a very similar thing, which is putting hands on sick people, healing people by spitting in their faces and their eyes, saying apatha, which in Aramaic meant to be opened, that he was actually part of a culture where this was happening. Most importantly, he was raised in a landscape where there was an intimate relationship with the actual landforms. So if we think of Aboriginal songlines as being the land used as a mnemonic device and also as an animate quilt of different flavors of divinity, we must remember that for every stone where a prophet received a vision, every stone you passed was a place where a prophet had received a vision. Every river you went to was a place where a major biblical event happened. So you were activating the scripture every time you went on a walk. Everywhere you passed was somewhere that was deeply important in your spiritual and ancestral inheritance. You memorized scripture, but every day you also walked through it. And so I've been calling these song lines as a pun on song lines, but the comparison is close. Because for most of the peasants of rural Galilee without access to scrolls and alphabetic literacy, the way they remembered their spiritual and ancestral inheritance was by telling the stories into the land and then receiving them back at both specific spatial and temporal locations, like going into the wilderness during tabernacles. You would physically do a symbolic action to actually locate yourself in the wilderness where your ancestors would have experienced hardship. Okay. So how can we begin to contextualize them within traditions that were already happening? He was a spirit worker, just like Elijah or Moses or Hanina ben Doza, all of these people. He had an experiential awareness of an intimate God that he could have a fluent channel with. He performed miracles and healing. He was also a wisdom teacher. He used parables and aphorisms, so pithy ways of getting people's attention. People who lived in oral culture and needed something really like rhetorically powerful to get their attention. And he was a social prophet, similar to the classical prophets of Israel. The important thing is he walked in and he was always critiquing both the little and the big tradition. He was criticizing what the folkloric traditions were, and he was also criticizing what the overculture was doing. So he straddled the two. And that was something that people in northern Galilee have been doing for a long time. That's really what Elijah was doing when he came and he critiqued the people of northern Israel and also critiqued King Ahab. He was always saying, like, nobody is doing this correct. Let me tell you, we need a totally new paradigm. So this is Hanina ben Doza and Honi the circle drawer. And healing was theater. We talked about this last time, that what if Jesus was a dancer or a rapper? You had to be. We now know that a lot of healing is theater. It's believing that we can heal, that activates our immune systems. And so Jesus was very much part of that placebo effect, which is an incredibly scientifically proven way of activating people's innate ability to heal themselves. So one of the things we have with the most authority is that Jesus probably studied with another historical teacher at the time called John the Baptist. He would have probably been called Yochanan the Immerser. And we have historical proof from him from a contemporary historian called Josephus. Josephus is really interesting because he is a Jewish historian who writes a bunch of different histories of Judaism throughout the process of colluding with the Romans and then denouncing them. So we have his take on events from many different perspectives, from pro-Roman and then pro-Jewish. So Josephus is a really interesting historian in that you have to compare him with himself to see where you land. But interestingly enough, he talks about John the Baptist. So we can really locate John the Baptist as being a historical figure. So the thing about John the Baptist that is interesting is that John the Baptist had a monopoly while Jesus had a franchise. And John the Baptist kind of made himself not super relevant because he was the only person who could immerse you and forgive your sins. That he was the head of a top-down movement, and he was located in specific places, and you had to go to him to get his wisdom. And the thing about Jesus is Jesus looked at that and looked at the fact that as soon as the head was cut off John, literally and metaphorically, the movement fell apart and said, okay, this didn't work. What about it didn't work? Was it the top-down organization? And so Jesus does something very different, which is he says, I'm not going to do a top-down organization. So what he did was he told his companions to go out and heal and eat food with the people you heal, and to do exactly as he was doing, but not to do it in his name and to not do it in God's name. And that's a big misconception that a lot of people have about Jesus, is that he told his disciples to do things in God's name. No, he actually just says, go and heal people. Don't tell anybody about the healing you're doing. Just eat with them afterwards. In fact, don't make a big hoopla about it. Don't tell people what you're doing. Just do it. He said, go and heal and share food with anyone who will share food with you. That was the bulk and entirety of his message and the way he materially spread his wisdom through Judea and Galilee. He also didn't locate himself in a specific location. He traveled so that you couldn't pin him down. And so I think about rhizomatic networks with multiple doors of entry where there's no central node of cognition. But if you damage one part, it can just branch off and go somewhere else. So conceivably, one of my favorite examples is John Dominic Crossan, who's a really incredible historian of this time period, says, so Jesus is preaching about the kingdom and about certain kinds of miracles that are possible within this belief sphere. And he's killed in Jerusalem. But it probably takes around 30 days for that news to spread to all of the different people practicing in his name, not in his name, but like inside this belief system he's been preaching. And by the time it reaches them, it's been a long time since he died. And they say, it didn't stop after he died. We were still eating food with people and healing people. So it probably has nothing to do with him being alive. We can still do this. This is still possible. So if you think about that mycelial network where you can take off a certain part of it and it keeps growing, that's the type of network that Jesus is facilitating. The biggest thing he did is he sent his students. Hello. All right. Bye. The biggest thing he did is he sent his students out with a necessary lack, with the lack of something, with an absence. He sent them out without food and without lodgings. And that meant that they had to create close connections with the people they healed and that they taught. Their need locked them into relationship with new communities and thus created a larger community of shared meals and storytelling and food. Food and healing worked together to create a metabolic network of mutual aid outside the urban centers of Galilee. This was directly opposed to the taxation of the time period and having to go into the city to pay your taxes, to buy your food. It was saying, we don't need the Romans anymore. We can create an anti-community where we all heal and help each other outside of Roman rule. And it's interesting for me because it reminds me of symbiosis. One being's lack is the space for another being to share its body and to help out. Biological novelty and evolutionary leaps are the product of two lacks interlocking to create mutuality and then an entirely new being. This is the basis of every landscape you see outside, every tree, every vegetable you eat and flower is the process of two lacks interlocking, which is those mycorrhizal systems 450 million years ago, interlocking with plants and teaching them how to have root systems. So it's that symbiosis that creates our nourishment today. And so I think of what Jesus is doing when he's sending his followers out without a staff, because initially in the Gospel of Mark, he says no staff. You're not allowed to bring anything to protect yourself. You can't bring food. You can't bring lodgings. You have to go sit with strangers. He's saying you have a lack that's going to draw in cooperation and other people, and it's going to create community necessarily. So I've thought about this, which is Jesus sending out his students with a lack is what the scientist and neuroanthropologist Terence Deakins calls an absential. And it's a form of evolutionary causality where something not there, something missing, acts like a magnet that draws forth an entirely new way of being. It draws in matter into an absolutely new shape. So the lack of the disciples draws on the lack of the sick, and they interlock to create something symbiotically novel, the kingdom. So then inside of this interlocking mutual aid system that he's creating, we have the Galilean exposome. And the Galilean exposome is at once ecologically rich and absolutely beautiful, an incredible place to grow food. But of course, all those farm fields are being converted into vineyards. But it's also a place where, if we think about the immune system as actually being influenced by the exposome, which is being written about more, which is like, the external factors that affect someone's health, we see that there's been incredible violence that people are always negotiating with. In 6 CE, when Jesus was just growing up, there were 2,000 women and children and men killed after the revolt of Judas the Galilean, crucified. And he would have been raised with, probably everyone he knew someone who had been killed by the Romans, and that he had seen these things. He had smelled them. He had heard the cries. I think it's in Josephus that we get the description of how long it took all the women and children to die on the crucifixes, and people hearing them for days screaming. That is part of people's bodies and their shared bodies. And if we think about how immune systems are dysregulated by trauma, we're not surprised that Jesus is a healer, because people are sick. And they're not just sick because that's what happens. They're sick because their entire cultural body is trying to negotiate radical, unpredictable violence all the time. And it's interesting for me because I have autoimmunity, and the very structure of autoimmunity, immunes, comes from the Roman word to describe a defective colony within the Roman Empire, one that doesn't follow the rules. And so autoimmunity is articulated within Roman imperialism. And if we look at a lot of these people that Jesus is healing, we can see them as people who harm themselves. That we think of possession as people who are violent, but ultimately, like in the demoniac, in the Gospel of Mark, the way their possession manifests is actually self-harm. That it's a way of inverting the harm that's being done to you, is you start to harm yourself. The autoimmune condition is not simply a personal sabotage. It is a profoundly historical condition precipitated by the exposome of injustice, pollution, and collective trauma. It turns out there is not a neatly bounded self. How then can we understand autoimmunity as being a radical revolt against the capitalist cult of individualism and an undermining of stable borders, both nationally and personally? So I oftentimes think of the ways in which people were ill and the kinds of illness that Jesus was encountering as being a way people were articulating a revolt they weren't actually allowed to enact without being killed. That if they were to actually revolt, they'd be slaughtered, like all of the people involved in Judas the Galilean's revolt. So instead, that repressed revolt starts to manifest in physical illnesses. So Jesus is coming into the nervous system of Galilee and saying, like, how can I begin to touch these pressure points and relieve this pressure, this collective pressure? Okay, yeah. So let me see. Another thing that was happening right now is that there was, part of Jewish culture is purity. And, I think there's been a lot of really, really simplistic ways in which that has been explained in modern interpretations of the New Testament. But the truth is that every culture has a purity map. It's just a way of saying, some things are pure in certain places, and then when they shift places, they're not pure. We all have them. And in fact, one thing I would offer as an exercise is to think about what your own purity maps are. Where are certain things okay in your life and where are they not okay? What things feel taboo, what things don't? The problem is that, in Jesus's time, in order to get pure, conceivably, you had to go to the temple all the way in Jerusalem and offer the right sacrifice. This meant that purity became slowly conflated with a specific place and the privilege and money to go there with ease. But this was impossible for most of the peasant class of northern Judea and for much of Galilee. What had started as a way of mapping sacred relationships, pressurized by Roman violence and commercialization, became an economic structure. To be rich was to easily be able to maintain purity customs. To be poor was to mostly be impure or to be adjacent to impurities that you were constantly negotiating. Tensions about how else purity could be obtained are crystallized in a figure like John the Baptist, who says, actually, you don't have to go to Jerusalem. You can come to me and we'll do it in the Jordan River, which is just right down the road. So many people, not just John and Jesus, but a lot of different figures in this time period were struggling with how to update and adapt purity laws to shifting economic and social pressures. The abject poor could never make decisions based on purity. Roman violence put them in a corner where they constantly had to be, colluding with the Romans in order to protect their families. They had debts to pay. They had to perhaps even work on the Sabbath because they were starving to death. And so Jesus was responding to this feeling of guilt that the people around him were constantly feeling, that they couldn't get pure. So many renewal groups, such as the Pharisees and the Essenes of Qumran, sought to create more stringent purity laws because they saw the violence they were experiencing and they were trying to make sense of it spiritually. What their purity laws aren't this kind of orthodoxy. I see them as a way of trying to understand why they're experiencing such violence. They're saying, maybe we haven't been pure enough. I feel like all of us have had this experience to some extent. It's been very much acted out by New Age wellness right now, which is just, if I'm experiencing hardship, it's because I'm not pure enough physically. I need to detox myself. I need to do these parasite cleanses. I need to lift up to a higher vibration. I think we're constantly trying to understand why we're experiencing suffering and then trying to figure out a way to control that so we can feel better. So I see the intensification of a lot of purity culture during this time period as being a trauma response, a survival mechanism of saying, how can we shift this? Maybe if we're more pure, we can shift this. But one of the ways Jesus was most radical was by kind of upending this purity culture. Jesus said, the purity is not on the outside. It's on the inside. There's nothing outside of a person that by going in can defile. He says that purity is about this constant dialogue with God and with sharing food and healing with other people. It's about relationality and community. And so his biggest upending of purity observances was in his open and inclusive table. And, this is not just inviting the poor to eat with you. That's a kind of like smug way of saying like, yeah, I worked at the soup kitchen. He invited everybody off the street and he mixed them together. And it was that mixing together, that compost heap of many different types of people that was most radical. Because, we can see the meal as a microcosm of the social system, and that his open table fellowship was the embodiment of a social vision. We think of open meals as kind-hearted mutual acceptance, but that neuters the radical act he was doing. Purity rules were most stringent about who you ate with and about how you ate. And he ate with tax collectors, with prostitutes, with Gentiles, with Samaritans, and he put them all together. And his meal was inclusive, and so was his movement. He included women. He included people who had worked for Herod, who was like his worst enemy, who had killed his teacher, John the Baptist. Johanna, who was one of the people who probably financially supported his ministry, was the wife, probably the widow of the steward of Herod. And interestingly enough, at a time when Roman banquets were in vogue, he offered an alternative meal that was not sparse or conservative, but equally festive and raucous. And not only did he practice banquets, he used them constantly in his parables. And it's we've lost what this was actually doing, but banquet imagery at this time period was most associated with the feminine principle of God, Chokmah. And that Chokmah's Sophia, the Shekinah is also loosely connected. But Sophia, wisdom, Chokmah, was considered to be the kind of intermediary of God, that Chokmah helped, the Israelites through the sea, guided them. That sometimes when God materially manifests, it's through Chokmah. And Chokmah sets her table and she invites people to eat with her. So when Jesus is always invoking banquet imagery, he oftentimes calls himself the child of wisdom. And we lose that. We think that's just kind of a neat thing to say, but he's saying, I'm the child of this feminine principle of God. And I honor this by creating these feasts where everyone is invited. Okay, so I've given you guys a lot of information because I'm very overexcited about all of this, but I want to open it up to discussion. And then at the very end, I am going to offer a very strange exercise that if you feel compelled, you can do. Let me stop sharing my screen. How do I do that? Okay, there we go. Okay, we have 67 chats. Yeah, Tada, bowel movement, actually that's a mistranslation. So a lot of times they would mistranslate womb to bowels, but they're not totally combined. It's more about feeling your stomach move. It's more about that like erotic clench when you kind of like feel something. So a lot of the times we see bowels in the New Testament and meant womb. Oh, interesting. So whoever wants to pop in and start reflecting on the exercises in the past week, on their collection of words, anything they felt about today, please unmute yourself. Yeah, the Lord's bowels are filled with compassion. It would be closer to saying like the Lord's generative womb space is filled with compassion. Okay.
I'll jump in if.
Please, and can we highlight you?
Yeah, so Adrian, I had a lot of thoughts at the beginning when you were talking about the women imagery, and I thought I would share an experience that was meaningful enough that I actually sort of became a tattoo in the last year. So right when my oldest daughter was born, she's 6, I was doing a lot of meditation centering prayer kind of thing. And I did it quite a bit when I was pregnant, and I was always very aware of her presence in my body when I would sort of drop into that sort of silent space. I remember the first time I went back after she was born, and it was pretty soon after where you're sort of, she wasn't in the room with me, but I was sort of very aware of her sort of presence, like close to my body psychologically still. I remember that sort of feeling of like, as I sort of dropped into that silence, like kind of still being aware of that like womb-like energy kind of surrounding her, even though she wasn't there. It was sort of that psychological sort of feeling. And I remember just sort of sitting with that image for a little bit and sort of imagining her in this space as this like newborn baby. And I had this sort of feeling as I sort of sat with it. It had like a texture, it had colors. It just, it was kind of a real vivid image in my mind. And then all of a sudden being aware of like my husband and then like the rest of the world kind of outside of that womb-like space. And I had this sort of feeling of like, oh, this is an energy you can pull people into. You know what I'm saying? It was just that sort of feeling of like, oh, this is your point of access to a different way of relating to anyone if you want to. And I didn't know at the time that the root word for compassion and mercy was also the root word for womb. So when I found that out, I don't remember exactly how much later, it made so much sense because I had that image kind of in my mind already. And so the tattoo, I won't go into it in detail, but the other part of it that I sort of added to that, because you connected it to ecology as well, but I had like kind of a spiritual experience reading the book Braiding Sweetgrass last year. And she has this part of the book where she talks about, nature mimicking womb imagery as well. And she had this like image of, it was beans actually, this idea of little beans having umbilical cords because they're kind of connected to the pod, which is like a womb. And it was just kind of this idea of like so many things in the natural world, mimicking that womb imagery. And then the other connection I think I'll end with was I've been thinking a lot about womb imagery as a way to sort of reclaim blood imagery in sort of as related to Jesus and things like atonement. I grew up with a lot of substitutionary atonement blood imagery, and I've just been sort of sitting with that because I think there's a lot of people that just are sort of throwing that away. And if you need to do that, I think that's totally fine. But I've just been sort of sitting with this and sort of feeling like, actually don't want to throw away all of the blood imagery. Is there a way to sort of think about it differently? And so I think that when I think about blood imagery, it's connected to, things like the womb and menstruation and birth, and just the idea of sort of that self-sacrificing, literally my body broken for you, as connected to birth and wombs. It sort of really transforms some of that imagery. Anyway, so I just thought I'd share all the stuff from your first couple of slides. I'm like, I've literally been thinking about this for years and years and years. So anyway, that's it.
That's amazing, Adrienne. And yeah, I mean, I think an interesting way to frame the blood stuff is part of what was radical about Jesus is that being unclean oftentimes meant that you had broken skin, and that you had pustules or you had a break in your skin. And also women were often considered impure because they might be bleeding. And one of the ways that Jesus upended purity laws was by touching people who were bleeding, and both through menstruation, but also through illness and through, autoimmunity and skin lesions and all sorts of, we think of it as leprosy as being one thing, but it probably denoted like 20 different things. And as someone who's experienced a lot of autoimmunity rashes, like, let me tell you, like sometimes you feel like no one wants to touch you. And so I think actually one of these ways we can tap into Jesus is he wasn't afraid of mess, and that the womb is messy. And that we can also, Tada was bringing up bowels, like the womb is the bowels, when you give birth, you shit, we forget that, like, no, really, like midwives are always like, who I talk to are always like, yeah, you shit when you give birth. Like, we don't talk about that. Like the two are intermingled. And so, and I think there was this way that Jesus, like the compost heap is this place where things that aren't supposed to touch and sprout something new. Jesus touched things he wasn't supposed to touch. Everything was mixing. And that was also true in terms of his table and who he allowed at the table. He allowed shepherds at his table. Shepherds were actually considered very unclean at the time period because they were working with oftentimes with cloven hoofed animals. And so it's really interesting to think about blood and Jesus as actually being part of his practice, his symbolic action, touching people who were bleeding. Hello?
Are we allowed to try? I'm in a lot of sunlight, so I can't see your screen. So I don't know if you're smiling in approval or you're like, am I interrupting something here?
Tada, you go on and then John will go on. We'll do it like that.
Okay, I didn't know if I just did the order just now because I just felt the unmiking. But so something that I've been really curious about, I don't know enough. I got to bow down because I don't know a lot of the details of the histories of these time periods. It's something I'm still educating myself on. But there's something that I've been reading into Shintoism in the scriptures over there, or scrolls, or just even like prayers that have been kept since the of kind of antiquity. And things like purity seem to read differently. So, for example, the Shinto prayer for purification summons a river goddess as one of the great 4 pillars of purity, right? But the more you pay attention to this river goddess, she's kind of a hoe. Is that they're like the energy of Shakti moving. So the purity actually comes from the flow of a river and the flow of her sexual energy, as opposed to the other way around. But there's ways in which, even within Shinto traditions, there's been an inversion of that over time. That's been paradoxically kept but there is an inversion of like that water of sexual energy being purifying versus being dirty. And Shinto has a lot of that, like women are bleeding so you can't touch men, like very similar. But the further you go back, there seems to be an inversion.
Yeah.
And I think that seems to make a lot of sense with the, like old Shinto is a lot more erotic and danced. Like one of the primary actual goddesses is a stripper, like literally that's her function. And so there's like this kind of, yeah, I'm really curious. I think when I hear about, sacrifice and those kinds of things, people wanting to do that for purity, what are the erotic rites that are probably paired with those that are not obviously part of the canon anymore, I would think. And I don't know them, but I'm just very curious. So I feel like you have that kind of data.
Yeah,
thank you so much for sharing all that you're sharing. It's kind of like for me. Yeah.
This is what I'm thinking about, especially because I've been really interested about how would have the Jews in Second Temple period Palestine really viewed sacrifice? Because I feel like our modern interpretation is not correct. Like there's this Christian Romanized idea of sacrifice as being like atonement. But I was reading this incredible interpretation was saying it was the time when you went to sacrifice was the time when you ate best. You brought food that then you gave part of it to the people, but you received part of it back. So it was a time when you were probably having the most sex because you had easy, close security. No, really, the most sex, you were eating good food. You were eating good food. You were probably most likely to like conceive during that time. But that sacrifice was a time period where you went and saw all your family.
Right.
So it's like, so I was thinking like sacrifice was a relational, communal, festive event that we've misunderstood over time. A couple of people have written about this, and I don't totally feel confident in that interpretation yet, but it definitely seems like we think of it as this atonement now. I also, in many different cultures, women being separated, being separated for menstruation was a sacred thing that then becomes a taboo thing. So, which is such an interesting thing, which is like it becomes uncleanness as patriarchy sin.
Right. Power and I want to add.
Tada, you're moving in and out of service. We're losing you. We are losing you. Okay.
I think I'm here. Am I here?
We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, I think there's just like a strong Africanist element that's undigested and unprocessed of our understanding of these things. And it's really important to understand Christianity and the origins of those religions in relationship to the Africanist practices, because then you start to see, like even the demiurge comes from Africa. Like if you actually look at, I think, through the mythology. So there's something there about taking an anthropological lens and using all these different cultural lenses. Because I think the origins of Christianity,
processes. Yeah, I mean, I also think
totally.
It's important to look. There's a great book called "Did God Have a Wife?" which is about folk archaeology, folk religion, and archaeology in Canaan and then Israel. That I'll recommend. So it just basically goes through like shrines and like documents what were in people's shrines, and you can see like, oh, people were practicing very weird polytheistic things that they were calling Judaism, but was something perhaps weirder. And that was happening contiguous with Jesus even. And that, Palestine is this place where all of these different cultures are moving through and diffusing. I think we should bring on John and just begin to move through people so we give everyone a chance. John, can we bring you up?
Yeah.
How do we do this? How do I highlight you? Cassandra, can we add? There we go. Hello.
Hi, Sophie.
Hi.
Thank you for this. This has been great. The question I have, I'm of Jewish descent on my mother's side and German Protestant on my father's side. And I've been part of a like earth-based Jewish renewal movement for the past decade. And it's been amazing, doing much of this work within the Jewish context. And in the past few years, personally, I've started to have my own revival with Jesus. And even in the earth-based Jewish movement, Jesus is still off limits. He's still very taboo at some level. And there seems to be this place where I think there is this cultural fear that by integrating or even really talking about Jesus, it start to have like the boundary of what is Jewish start to falter. And then we lose the sense of identity as a people. And I'm in myself really trying to seek to, one, understand how did Jesus and Judaism really start to break or get far apart? How did that boundary get created? And was Jesus thinking of himself as like a Jewish teacher or prophet? And what is it now to reintegrate him into the Jewish canon? And what does that mean? Is that even, does that make cultural sense? So this is kind of the
This is something I've thought about a lot. So I almost wanted to say this at the start of the course, but I'll say it now, which is we are planting Jesus back in his Judaism as a person who was seeking to reform Judaism, saw himself as a Jew, never even probably thought to include Gentiles. That's probably a much later thing. He probably never even thought that they would be involved because it was so ecologically and contextually situated. He really thought of himself as like a Jew in Jewish Galilee. Here's the thing, we are not seeking to give Jesus back to the Jews. They don't need him. They have a fully realized religion that has withstood almost complete extinguishment and has managed to still like not kill other people. I mean, I think that's the thing is like, Jesus is doing something that's radical and a critique of Judaism inside of Judaism that probably fails. And I think that's the thing we need to keep coming back to is, and I was going to say this, but I didn't. Jesus is one of the only major religious figures who doesn't live a full life and have his teaching evolve. We get a snapshot of the first paragraph of the first chapter. And then we pretend like that we can disseminate that to many different cultures, landscapes, ecologies over 2,000 years, and it can still be applicable. What we're really getting with Jesus is the snapshot of a Jewish Galilean healer very much attending to the specifics of Roman imperial rule, taxation, and illness. And then he's murdered before he can even develop his, that's one of the tragedies that we need to feel in our bodies is like, what would he have said if he had like let his teachings develop? He was very critical of his own Judaism in a way that might have like changed over time. And in fact, one of the things is, which we'll talk about later, is when the Romans come in and co-opt the religion, the teachings of the person they killed, they need a villain. So they make the Pharisees into the villain. But the truth is Jesus's followers were often Pharisees. And in that religious disagreement and dialogue was part of the culture. So the contention between the Pharisees and Jesus was typical of all teachers. And I think that's one of the things that like we need to like realize that the critique of Pharisees is very much imperial anti-Semitism. So I think my real response to you would say, I don't think we want to give Jesus back to Judaism because he's been used to harm them and to kill them so many times. And he also wasn't a fully realized Jewish teacher. He was like an ineffectual Jewish teacher. But it's important to understand him in his Jewish context. This whole class is not about saying that Jesus is a perfect spiritual teacher. It's about saying, how did he get misused? What was he actually saying as a person inside a context? What glimmers of wisdom were there? What perhaps did he do wrong? What happens?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That was great.
Oh, no, hold up. Oceana, yeah. No, absolutely. Everyone alive today has been implicated in harm. I'm saying that to the extent that Christianity has killed almost everybody, Judaism has not killed everybody to quite the same extent, but they are definitely implicated. How is Jesus ineffectual? I would say that if he was co-opted in this way, he was ineffectual. We're talking about how stories travel. Jesus' story doesn't travel. It travels, but it travels after having been mistranslated almost immediately. And sometimes I think that if he had lived like 30 years and had a developed repertoire of teachings that were finally fermented, and he got to amend his teachings and see how they sometimes didn't work, maybe they would have not been as corrupted as easily. I see him as being interrupted. I think maybe ineffectual isn't the thing. I see him as being an angry young guy who's very, very angry, very, very briefly, and says some amazing things and then gets killed, and his teachings kind of degrade pretty much immediately. Are we going to talk about Paul? We'll talk about him in the last one. Paul didn't know Jesus, but we'll talk about Paul. So he's not super useful in our actual engagement with Jesus. Although actually the funny thing is you could think of most Christianity today as being Paul's Christianity. Yeah, Morgan has said, I feel like Christianity is really Paulism. Yes, exactly. Paul came in and said, I didn't know Jesus, but I'm going to channel him. Yeah. Yeah, Paulism was mostly urban too. Yeah. Paul's an interesting character. I don't want to totally demonize him. But he definitely wasn't Jesus. And a lot of what we attribute to Jesus actually belongs to Paul. There's a very interesting book that I'll put in the resources called Rabbi Paul by Bruce Chilton that really looks at the historical context of him. Okay, let's bring on Mark Farrell. Farrell, how do we bring you on? There you are. Hi.
Hello. Yeah, Farrell. Just fast, like absolutely loving the conversation in the chat right now about white supremacy and how Europe is probably an intersection of so many different things. But then they were like, we're novel and it's just us and these are all our ideas. So just loving that. I think what's coming up for me and what was really interesting was the articulation of this time period as moving from agrarian, moving from land-based to the Romanization. I think you said the Romanization then led to urbanization, which then led to commercialization. So this like absolutely cataclysmic reorganization of how we live our lives, and how like Jesus is this person that's able to articulate what is so frustrating about this transition that wasn't consensual.
Yeah.
And then also tying the thread of like the similarities with like purity culture and this like emphasis of purity in that time, and then now looking at a lot of people's reaction to our current issues and it being the same, like, well, I just have to like make myself as pure and raise my vibration enough to somehow do the work and get out of this and organize my communities to escape the shifts that are happening now. And I don't really feel like I have the words for what is occurring, but it feels like it's another one of those chains. Like it's another one of those like things are going on, and it feels like it's there's a not consensual shifting of the way that we're living our lives in terms of technology, in terms of the way that we're relating with one another, in terms of, once again, our food systems. Like there's so many things that are shifting. So it just feels like another pressure cooker moment. And I guess I'm just interested, like, in terms of maybe like the second coming of Christ, you know, like what prophets will emerge, or like what is the what Jesuses will we have today in this shift? Just seeing the similarities and feeling very like juicy about like the next couple decades, and like who are the prophets, what's going to be the articulation of these issues. So just musings.
Sorry, I'm just trying to keep up on all the messages while I'm talking to you guys. It's going to be kind of hard for me to do it. Yeah, I think something I've been really interested in is how you see purity culture intensify in moments of extreme imperial oppression, that they like seem, and then you see eschatological movements, apocalyptic movements. We're going to talk about that next time. We're not going to talk about eschatology, which is like the coming of the end today. But you see a lot of those things coincide. And I've been looking at our culture right now and seeing, like, you see with, you know, giant agricultural monopolies, people having their farms being taken, people losing all their housing, you know, people, you know, entire indigenous populations displaced from their land. You're seeing a lot of the same themes come up. I think maybe for me, it's not about looking for prophets, because Jesus failed. That's really weird. This is not an apologist. You know, Jesus was killed at age 33, and his message was immediately used by the empire he was trying to undermine. So I think right now, humans are not the answer. The answer are going to be everything else. And our prophets are going to be this is what I'm trying to root us into. It's going to be our Galilee. It's going to be our place where we're situated with the people who are really struggling in the specific way that they're struggling. Like I'm seeing right now where I live in the Hudson Valley, that it's become the most popular spot for incredibly wealthy people to move from the city. And, struggling locals who've lived on property for hundreds of years are forced to sell their land. And then all the public waterways are being, the Woodstock Land Conservancy is taking bribes, is corrupt, taking bribes from the wealthy people to inappropriately block off public land that borders wealthy people's property. So suddenly the people who've been displaced from their land can't access waterways anymore. And these people are getting really, really angry. And so I'm seeing, like, in a microcosm way, the frustration of people who were landed here, having their land taken away from them, suddenly working jobs they hate that are terrible, bad for them. And what do you do? Yeah, I think there's a lot of frustration right now. And perhaps the way forward is not with prophets, but with, very slow, careful movements, listening and tuning in to the advice of invasive species and plants and mountains and people who have survived violence. Okay, the story is global. Yeah, it is global, but it's also different in different places. And those differences are what make a difference, as Gregory Bateson says. Yeah, okay. I'm looking at everything in the chat. It's hard for me to keep up. Yeah, Oceana, yeah. He was embedded in a Judaic borderland culture. He was a prophet of the Afrocene, exactly. And that was being diffused in through Egypt, One of the interesting things is, like, coming out of Egypt is also a way of saying, like, coming out of Africa. Like when we talk about the Exodus story, we're also talking about, like, coming out of Africa. Yeah. Okay. Does anyone? All right. Let's have someone else pop in. Damascena, is that how you pronounce it? Let's have you come in.
Yes. Hello. Hi. I have the experience of living overseas. I'm married to a Palestinian Christian, and we lived overseas for several years during the 2000s. And the interesting thing, like, I have some observations. So prior to getting married, I had 2 sons. I wasn't married. My oldest son is gay, and he was welcome into their family in the most normalized, regular way. And it had been an area of concern because I grew up as a Christian bred here, and all of the political stuff we have. So it was interesting to go to church and continue to be a Christian with people who haven't gone through, like, they're Orthodox. Some of them go to a Lutheran church, but they haven't gone through that process of being at a church that's traveled across Europe and then landed, and all of the different iterations that it went through. So anyways, I have my daughter come back here, and I want to christen her at the local Maronite church, which is kind of like an Arabic church. And we did it within the first 40 days after I had her. And the priest asked me, I don't know what he said. He was speaking in Arabic to somebody else. And essentially, we weren't allowed to walk inside the sanctuary of the church. We had to leave, and it was winter. And I'm like, this is really strange. Why are we going around to the front of the church? And my friend who was with me, who spoke to the priest in Arabic, said, well, because you're still bleeding, you can't go in the church. First of all, I don't know how he knew I was still bleeding. The way it landed in my body, that I would actually participate in that kind of I'm not clean enough to be in the church type of mentality, and then go and christen my daughter at that place. I left. I went and sat in my car while she christened. And I've never had the same relationship with the church since then. And I asked, do they do that in Palestine? Because I didn't run across ever hearing about that. I didn't christen a child there, but and I was told, no, that's not a thing. in the Orthodox Church. Like you can go into the church and christen your child. So it's really interesting, I guess, for me to track how much empire has co-opted, or the Roman culture has co-opted the practices and like embedded these really, I don't know, to me, it felt harmful. The way it landed in my body was almost like a violation to hear that about myself, not being welcome in the church because I was bleeding. So anyways, I just wanted to share that because it's been fascinating to know Christian people who act like Jesus. That's their religion, is to be love. So.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I'm also looking at this chat from B. Skolnick, which I think we should go to next. I also think, just to go back to the last session, you know, there are rules that work for a day. There are rules that you need for a day. Like if you've been open cut, you need to put a Band-Aid on and you don't want it to get infected. And you have that rule for a day about not washing your hand or not doing something and keeping it apart from something else. And I think one of the issues we see in textual culture is that rules that worked for a day don't work 2,000 years later. So it's a lot of like purity rules need to be oral and adaptive and instructive and constantly being updated for new information too. So we're also seeing the crystallization and fetishization of like one day's worth of information. And so I sometimes think like we always have some kind of purity understanding that helps us navigate having a body, but they get really perverted and problematic when we enshrine them and pretend like they don't need to shift. Yeah, B was saying, I've done a lot of research on Greek thinkers, philosophers, mathematicians, and the majority of whom studied in Alexandria and other temple schools in Northern Africa, and they all credit their education some roots in a way that as the white supremacy culture grows, largely disappears. Yeah, exactly. We have to remember that all of these people didn't begin in Europe. Like they stole things and then brought them to Europe. How did the Roman Empire become empiric? Well, it's a, you know, this is kind of one of the questions of the whole thing. There's a dominator impulse in Greece and in that area that through Alexander the Great and his conquest of all of like pretty much all of the Mediterranean basin becomes the dominant impulse. Like how can we spread as far as possible? There is a good book about that that I will also put in the resources if you want to go really, really deep with that. And if you like amazing historical fiction TV, which I kind of do, there's a great TV show about this kind of transition into the Caesars called Domina. It's very historically accurate. Okay, let's bring on Maya. Hi, Maya.
Hi, it's actually backtracking a little, but I think it was it Mark was saying the non-consensual shift in how we're living.
Yeah,
it really struck me and is struck me as like terrifying, but very true. It's really chiming with lots of things I'm feeling. And I recently moved from a very wild place to a city and have been definitely experiencing some grief from that, but also struggling to breathe and realizing that I feel very, very trapped in, not just in the physical sense of all the buildings and all the concrete, but also like there are so many people on top of each other and we don't get to talk, and like everyone's life is a bubble which like meets someone else, but they don't mix ever, they just like bounce off sometimes. And maybe I'm still just new to the city and haven't met enough communities, but it feels like there's this, you know, there's this drive to get more people living in an urban environment and to get them on this machine of like, yeah, of just the way the cities need to live and need to unroll, and getting a job and like buying a property, and the access to green spaces is becoming such a privileged thing that it's harder and harder. And unless you're like white and wealthy and middle class and like cis and straight and all of those things, you're just never going to get to go there easily. And it's, I don't know, it's just like really, I think part of that feels like it makes sense, because actually if you are out in those wild spaces, and if you're taking time to listen and to walk and to be with, you kind of lose that individuated way of thinking. And you, like, even if you'll see another being and you want to ask them who they are and what they're doing, whether that's a human or whether that's a bird, you know, like where we used to live, I knew all of my neighbors, I knew all of them, and we would go around for tea, and if the power went out, you would bring around food for each other, and you would bring around candles. Like it felt like we were living in another age, you know. And now I'm in the city and I don't know the person who lives above me, and it's so strange to me. So yeah, I feel like that kind of, you lose that dialogue with non-hierarchical community, and you lose that relationship with it, which makes it much easier to like push you in a way of living that is further about the self and the individual, and like not forming this radical, inclusive, you know, community that fosters wisdom and compassion and all of these things. Yeah, that's just in my thoughts.
I think this is one of the big questions, and thank you for every single thing you brought up. I mean, it's also, we see this in so many industrial and commercialized states, which is you have your land taken away from you, you have your ways, you get sicker because your whole way of life is disrupted and you're subjected to violence, you can't feed yourself, and then you have no money, so you have to move to the city to get a job, and then you get sicker. You know, it's this movement into the cities is part of what happens in Galilee. Is everything gets centered in the city, so you have to go into the city to pay your taxes, to learn, to meet people, to buy things, and all of a sudden you're having to enter into the space that has taken your land and taken your life from you. And I think a lot of us have, and then you can't make a living in the city either, and you can't live a good life. I think a lot of us have been contending with that, and how to interrupt it. I mean, one of the ways I used to really feel like cities were just bad, there was no saving them. And I have, since reading The Dawn of Everything by David Wengrow and David Graeber, I've been just trying to massage that belief system in myself, because it seems like there was a long period of time where humans lived in a much more cyclical way, which is sometimes they were nomadic and then they would go into cities and civilization for a little bit, like part of the year. And it was not a place that you spent all your time. It was a place that you did certain things in, like you gathered, and then you spent time in the wilderness, like we talked about with Exodus, that you needed different styles of life so that you could access different ways of being. And so I don't necessarily think cities are bad, but the focus on them, the way in which they have co-opted our entire way of thinking about human beings should live, feels really problematic, especially because they're so abstracted from food webs. They have no relationship to their waste, and they also have no relationship. Carol Hayes was saying, I was just thinking about, honey fungi are considered a parasitic fungi. They create mycelial mats, and they take down trees. So they're considered parasitic because they kill trees, they kill their root systems. But what they're really doing is they're called meadow makers. They're bringing down trees to nurse the soil, mulch into the soil, open up space so biodiversity can come in, and forests can become more complex ecosystems. And I think in cities we have skyscrapers that never come down. And what we really need to do is act like that honey fungi and go in and decide which trees to take down to open up meadows. Like, how do we create these places where we let things compost? I don't have the answer for that. I don't live in a city right now. I do think that beginning to get our resources from each other and not from the systems that pretend like they're there to help us is one of the best ways to undermine empire. Like, that's what he was doing. He's saying, we don't need to go to the doctor. We don't need to go to these people who say that we have to pay this amount of money. We can all help each other out. Okay. Maya, is your hand up? Do you want to come back on?
No, I didn't. I just don't know how to put it down. But I also, I also will just say that, I really don't want to denigrate cities totally. I'm seeing that they're like really helpful for access and all sorts of things. I think a lot of reaction to my personal grief that I'm experiencing at the moment. And I think that yeah, I know there are ways to foster community and inclusivity in cities, and I'm hopeful that I can, yeah, work to find those in Glasgow.
Yeah, I want to speak to Sarah. Yeah, I mean, I think one of these things is we have this very heteronormative Eurocentric idea of like what's natural and what's not natural, and cities have oftentimes been associated with marginalized people, with queer people, and with disabled people who need like access to technology into cities and to like easy access and transport. And we need to problematize what's natural and what's not natural. Like cities occur. I mean, termites create their colonies. I mean, there are natural cities. Hives are kinds of cities, but can we do cities in a way that's perhaps more ecological, more like the termites, more like the bees? You know, I sometimes think of like, you know, there's no such thing as one bee. Like one bee alone is no bee. You need a lot of bees together to create the system of bees that brings beeness into being. And I think that cities are kind of like that, but they've become wedded to patriarchy and into dominating impulses in a way that makes them problematic. Looking at these things. Oh, there's so much interesting stuff here about cities. Yeah, I mean, cities are also like, they are the ultimate compost heap. They're where people from different cultures rub up against each other and new things sprout up. I mean, it's important that they're not unnatural, but they can be used for not unnatural purposes, for purposes that are violent and are not generally benefiting the aliveness of the world. So we talked at the beginning of the course about Andreas Weber's idea of enlivenment. I think cities can sometimes be generative towards the total enlivenment, but the way they're structured now, not necessarily. Okay. Yeah, Oceana, the dance between cities and the wild. Yeah, so how can we honor those festivals where we go back into the wilderness and then we get our information? I oftentimes think of the figure of Merlin in English mythology, who advises kings, but then has to go back to the woods, and that the advice on how to create a kingdom never comes from inside the kingdom, it always comes from outside the kingdom. Like when your prophets arrive, it's never from inside the city, it's always from outside the city coming into the city. So how can we create that, you know, reciprocal looping of information? Okay, let's bring in Ansu. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I just wanted to pop in and share a little of what I was doing with my clay-covered hands while you were speaking, and I want to talk about something you said. But here, in terms of the city and bringing the intelligence and vitality of nature back into the city, here's what I was doing. I hope you can see it. Those are clay balls made with compost and wildflower seeds. I live in Southern California, so you can't just throw the seeds out because we have 8-9 months of no rain. I put them in these seed balls like this that I've been making all the while. And I put them out like in the parkways surrounding the streets. And a lot of us are doing this, and this is a way of re-indigenizing the vegetation here that was erased from colonization and replaced with, you know, alien grass, European and Midwestern plants and Australian plants and so forth. So in my neighborhood, there's a movement to bring back sort of the California flora and the whole biome of this region. And I think that there is this like, you know, undefined but insidious movement to re-indigenize and rewild. And I think that's a positive thing that happens in cities where we're rubbing elbows with people who think differently. Just near here in Ventura County, which is that intense agricultural land, which is like a cancer on the land when you see the fields, you know, of production. they don't have this kind of thing. So there's a positive thing to be said about cities, is that our ideas rub off on each other, and that productionist, extractivist agriculture that's going on outside is in purportedly the open land that's not a city, but here's where there's more biodiversity, frankly. If you don't mind, I want to just touch on the point you made about the intelligence of nature and how in Galilee in the past, the healers were tapping into the intelligence of nature and the sacredness and able to heal others. You know, I come from a church which uses Aramaic as its language, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And my grandfather was a priest in that church. And I remember him telling me about these healers, this is in southern India, who had intuitive powers, who, when somebody came to their doorstep, they knew who was ailing and what it was, whether it was a snake bite or what it was. They knew how to read that. And I always thought, well, what does that mean? Like, how did they know that? And who are these magical powers? And I thought your explanation of that closeness and vitality and that intuition power was incredible. I've never had anyone explain it like that. So thank you for that. I've enjoyed this tremendously.
Well, thank you so much for all that you have added onto our collective compost heap. I love what you're doing with the clay balls. Please add, are you on the Discord? Because like, update us, give us pictures. Yeah. I do think that we all have healing we can offer right now. Everyone's really sick. I mean, I think one of the things I've been thinking about is everyone was really, so there are more healing episodes attached to Jesus than any other figure in the Bible up to that point. And I don't think it's because he was a better healer. It's because more people were sick at that time. The people were really, really, really traumatized and experiencing incredible violence, and they were sick. And I think right now I'm really ill, and I rub up against a lot of people who are really, really ill. It seems like a lot of people are really, really sick right now, mentally, spiritually, and physically. And I think it's a time for us to try and think about, where can we get healing? Let's not have any purity about where healing comes from. Sometimes it's a pill, sometimes it's a chemical, sometimes it's putting your body in a specific place in the landscape. But how can we just all tool our healing, because we're all really, really sick? And so I think one of the reasons why I'm attracted to this time period is because I want to go to one of those healers. I have that desire. I think of like Mary Magdalene goes and she's healed of 7 devils. What we know from actually looking at the Aramaic is that probably that meant seizures or some kind of physical issue, not sin. Probably she went because she was really, really sick and she experienced a cure. And I think about that, like, what would it be if I went to someone? I've been to every doctor or New Age healer I know. What would it mean to show, I'm looking for someone who's so tapped into the environment that they can read me, and then they can lay hands on me and convince me, perform the theater that lets me activate my own immune system. So this is high stakes for me. This is in my own body. Yeah. Who else wants to come on?
Is it okay if I make a little small return?
Yes, please.
Oh.
Can we highlight you? Hello.
Sure. I love a highlighting. Hello, I'm highlighted. I'm on a mobile, so I can't tell that I am, but hello. Just this piece around like how the world is changing non-consensually. And then there is this period of like, oh, what is going to happen to address the situation? So I think there was even talk of like, who are the prophets and the second coming? You know, that's all very dramatic. But I think I'm just going to say, as a Japanese person, I've really felt like, oh shit, the world needs my ancestors more than they ever have. And I've been caught in a lot of like, wait a second, I'm like a city boy. You know, but then epigenetically and culturally through my ancestry and through the culture, I have so much like, oh yeah, that's like the ecosystemic viewpoints are just so maintained and become part of my DNA that I feel usually like I can't actually behave like my ancestors, but I know what kind of bullshit they would tell me. And I'm happy to share that with people. But it's like almost a cultural pressure. I've been feeling it's like the pressure on a cultural level of like, oh, Asian people need to talk up now. Oh, okay. Oh, weird. Okay, this is actually a little bit our time in terms of like a sustainable, large scale ecological systems. That's like that's, if you really get down to the essence of the Asian way, it's about, yeah, like these fertile lands and how to like retain sustainable ecosystems on top of it. That's been the major essential conversation in Asia for hundreds of years. So there's something, yeah, in the time period. And I just wanted to put that out there because there was, I don't know, it just felt like an emergent feeling. And honestly, I've been grappling and struggling with this a lot. So this is my kind of time to emotionally poop a bit in this container. One Straw Revolution, yes. And also the clay bombs reminded me, the clay bombs, right? Reminds me of that. Was it, his tactics of like, I'm gonna use this ball, see what happens. But yeah, thank you for witnessing that slight emotional poop bowel movement.
I love the emotional poop, and I agree. I think that white supremacist, colonial, Eurocentric, Antichrist, Christ as Antichrists culture has held center stage for too long. And we need the ancestors to speak through the people who've made it to this point from other cultures. We need a biodiversity of other perspectives. And please bring it on. And if we can support you in being louder and signal boost, let's all do it. Okay, so I'm trying to think about time a little bit because we've been on here a long time. I think we have time for one more question, and then I really want to give an exercise that's super weird. So let's bring Sarah on.
Great, thank you. I think I'm going to be pinned in a second. Yeah, great, thanks. Thanks so much.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you too. I'm glad I was able to make it live today. And I think I was wanting to ask about one of the rabbit holes that I think that you must have gone down. I just want to hear more about this idea about psalm lines and song lines. Part of the ecosystem restoration practice that I have in myself that maybe is going to become something I offer publicly is to receive the songs of healthy lands and then sing those songs to the lands that want healing, and sort of trusting in the way that the mycelium communicates to me, and then the way that my breath with all of its hormones and spittle and blah, 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 is then also offering that kind of, and like just doing my bit, using my breath and my body and my muscles to do my bit. And so I guess I really loved what you said about the psalm lines and the song lines, and this idea of wilderness and nature as scripture. And I just want to hear more. I want to just hear more about that because it was just one slide. So say more things, please.
I'm writing a whole chapter on this. I think what you're doing is amazing. It's so interesting. I was also thinking of the musician Cosmo Sheldrake records bird songs, and like especially of like birds going extinct, makes these songs out of the bird songs, then plays them back to the land. Mm-hmm. And it's such an interesting reciprocity. So like that way of closing the loop. Mm-hmm. How can you heal the land with the information it gives you about itself? I mean, oh gosh, so much to say. I think that the missing gospel is the land itself. Mm-hmm. And if we think about Hebrew as being only consonants with no vowels, as you need that extra contextual information to breathe into it, that extra contextual information is the land. The missing gospel, the missing part is always the land. And you need that, we talked about how Jesus was setting up absences, necessary absences that required people to lock into each other. It's those absences in us that require us to ask the land for help, to breathe into it. I mean, I think that we have denigrated so many different ways of knowing, so many different bodily epistemologies, that we think that like our intuition is somehow woo. But I think that we can receive information about the land, about what the land needs. I have a friend who bought a big piece of property to save it, pretty much, from being developed. It's where there are a lot of indigenous stoneworkings that are not protected locally. And she just kind of wanted to keep it, but she also knew that she had to tend to the land. She couldn't just let it be. And so she's been like praying with it for a long time, being like, where do I offer things? How do I help you? And it's been so interesting to watch her kind of walk over it with her like acupuncture needle of her feet, tapping into all of that mycelium. Yeah. Oh, cellar spiders. Okay, so I think we're gonna have to wrap up. And I'm gonna give everyone an exercise that's kind of about this, but next time let's talk quite a bit. I think I wanna open up more space for talking next time so that everyone feels like they have space. So here's my exercise, and I'll send out the actual essay that I wrote about this, but a while back, about 4 years ago, my dad gave me this big rock from this mountain I loved. And he was like, I don't know why I had a dream, but I had to give you this rock. I had to take it off the mountain and give it to you. And I had no idea what to do with it. It's like quite heavy and odd. And I was having a stressful time in my life. It was quarantine. Yes, this was, 2020. And I started to sleep with the rock under my pillow. And when I started to sleep with it under my pillow, I started to feel like, I think this rock wants to go on pilgrimage. And so I started to say, like, where do you need to go? Instead of asking myself where I wanted to go, like, I started to say, where does the rock want to go on pilgrimage? What if there's carbon in this rock that was once part of the same being that's carbon somewhere else, and I'm facilitating a material reunion that I don't even know about? How can I facilitate material reunions and homecomings and movements that are both too macro and too micro for me to ever possibly know, but I can be a vessel of them? And so I started to trace psalm lines through the land, just trying to tap in to where the rock wanted to go. And I was thinking, like, is this how a mountain sporulates? Is this how mountains are born? Like, it's a little like burr from the mountain, and I'm unknowingly like taking it somewhere else where it like releases a little bit of itself. So this is a silly exercise, but I think we need more silly exercises, which is find a rock, a pebble, a shell, anything, a piece of wood. It doesn't need to be a rock. Anything that is stable and not alive that you didn't kill. And start asking it where it wants to go. Start spending time with it. Put it under your pillow. Meditate with it. Say, what journeys can I help you go on? And then all of a sudden you are thinking about movement. So I've been thinking a lot about how Jesus lived in a culture of movement. He created a movement where he was always going from town to town. He came from a scriptural tradition that is like, you need to be ready to move at any minute and to bring your God with you. And so I've been thinking about, what does it mean to move with another object, asking it for guidance? They move with the ark, they moved with the Ark of the Covenant, but that's also an object that they were asking for divine advice. Like, where do we go? Where is the land of milk and honey? So my exercise is saying, like, go on pilgrimage with your being, with your object, and start to ask where you need to go on pilgrimage, and see, maybe like download a map, see what shape that even draws. Okay, does anyone have any last comments before we go? Anything that they're dying to say? Everybody, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And next time we're actually going to go into the parables and the weird ecological wisdom. If you want to prepare for next lesson, you could read, and I'm going to provide a link for this in the resources of this session, the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the earliest texts we have. It's not included in the Gospels, but it's definitely probably representative of the way Jesus probably taught. So if you want to prepare, you don't have to, you can read the Gospel of Thomas. It's very short and it's very fun and very weird. Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much.